Okay, let's talk about arrays in C#. So individual studio, and we will create an array, and syntax looks like this. I'll call this one list, and that is an array reference variable. And I point that out because that means that we don't actually have an array. What we have is something that could be used to reference an array. So arrays, all arrays are reference types. So in other words, list itself is not an array and must be initialized. So I can say list equals new and use similar syntax and initialize that array. And like other things in C#, this is a zero-based index array, so that's element 0, that's element 1, that's element 2, and that's element 3. So the list length would be 4. Therefore, the last element of the array would be list sub list dot length minus 1, which would be, in this case, index 3. You can also create an array as just a new int and then give it a specific number. So let's say 5, just to show that we've added 1 to it. And when I say added 1 to it, I want to be careful there because I don't mean that it took the original array and added the original array, which is here, and added a new value. I mean it created 5 new elements, indexed 0 through 4. And the value of each of those elements, and I'll just pick the third element arbitrarily, will be 0. And we can run this and see that. So the first item printed out was 4, and the second one was 0. In other words, the original length of the array was 4, and the value of the index element 3 of the new array with 5 elements was 0, because that got automatically initialized. So let's consider what this looks like pictographically. So I have a reference variable called list, and the data type of that reference variable is integer array. So when you first declare the array, again, you haven't really created an array, you've just created a reference variable that could point to an array if you had one. And then when you allocate some storage and initialize that, you're actually creating that storage on the heap, and in this case it would be 3 elements where each of those elements was an int, and they had the values 5, 10, and 15. So that's important. So again, the takeaway here is that arrays are reference types. So let's consider what this means in terms of passing an array as a parameter. So let's construct a situation where we have a method that takes an array as a parameter. Let's see, how about total value, and it'll be pass list, and then we'll construct that stub. And as you can see, the parameter here is of type integer array. So let's use a for each loop to iterate through so the method does something with an array, as you can see here. The question is, what's actually being passed? And the answer to that is that we're passing the same thing we always pass, which is to say a value. The question is, what value is it? So if we have our list array, which points to some elements, and we'll give them arbitrary values. This is in the main scope. So what does it look like in the total value scope? And the answer is that there is another reference variable, this in fact a reference parameter, and it's being given a copy. So again, we're passing the value, or it's getting the value of the address of the first element. So in other words, we have two things called list, and they point to the same thing. And that's significant because if we change, for example, in total value, if we were to change list sub 1 to say be equal to 10, what that means is it's going to use this pointer to go to here, wipe out this value, and replace it with this value. So even though it's passed by value language, because the value that we're passing is an address, we can affect the data in the original scope. On the other hand, if we were to say list equals null, what we would be doing is simply deleting this reference value, and then this list would be set to nothing. So in that way, it is different. But for whatever reason, let's consider the idea that we do want to modify the array reference variable as opposed to just the elements in the reference variable. Okay, so in other words, when you pass an array in this sort of normal way, you will be able to modify its contents because, again, it's a reference type. However, you're not able to actually modify the reference variable itself because what you're doing is you're passing a value that the reference variable has, but not the reference variable itself. So if for whatever reason you wanted to do that, you could. The way to do that is to use the ref keyword. So when you call the method, you would use a ref keyword. And when you declare the method, you would use a ref keyword. And now list in this scope does not point to the same thing as list in this scope does. In fact, list in this scope points back to list in the other scope. In other words, it looks like this. However, despite that, C# is smart enough that this code will still work. And we can see that fairly easily. So let's comment this one out so that we actually have an array with values in it of some interest. And now, of course, this will no longer be 0 because element sub 3 would be 0, 1, 2, 3. That would be element sub 3 would actually be equal to 3. So I will comment that out because it's no longer true. And then I will call my total value with my ref list and write out the result and run the code. And you see here that the sum of that array is 47. And further, if you did, inside of this method, want to change the value of the original list, you could do something like this. And then we could repeat this code. You would see that the second value is 0 because we've actually changed the array list itself so that it would look like this. And now that we've done that, we'll run the code. And there's the first array summed up, and there's the second array summed up. And that modification was actually made by the method. So having said all that, it's relatively rare that you'd want to pass a reference to an array. So we really probably want to go back to our original construction that looked like this. And now this statement really makes very little sense. but it does give you an idea of what an array actually is and what it means to pass an array to a method. And that's arrays in C#.